Good afternoon, y'all. Welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah Ropalato. I'm the managing attorney with Legal Services of Northern California and a proud Housing California board member. I'm honored to introduce the next session, Decriminalizing Poverty and Advancing Housing Justice. As a legal aid attorney, I'm far too familiar with the impacts that the criminal justice system has on people's ability to exit homelessness and secure stable and affordable homes. Thank you to our friends at the ACLU for bringing this conversation together today. I'm glad to turn it over to Brandon Green, the Director of Racial and Economic Justice Program at the ACLU Foundation of Northern California.
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to be here and to hopefully have what we think will be a sort of great discussion about the intersections between the criminal legal system and housing justice, and the ways in which some of the current policy approaches aren't really meeting the need in terms of reentry and other things. As Sarah mentioned, my name is Brandon Green. I direct the Racial and Economic Justice Program at the ACLU of Northern California. And I'm joined by some colleagues who I will let introduce themselves. I will start with Andrea.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrea Brown. Thank you, Brandon, for having me this afternoon. I am an assistant public defender with Alameda County, currently in Oakland, supervising our branch office here. So I'm happy to participate in the conversation this afternoon.
Thank you, Andrea. Ken?
Sure, thanks for that, Brandon. My name is Ken Oliver. I'm the Director of Business Development for the CROP organization. We are a workforce development and housing reentry organization, and really looking forward to being amongst this wonderful panel you put together to talk about important issues of housing and reentry.
And finally, Vonia.
Hi, thank you, Brandon. My name is Vonia Quarles. I'm the Director of Starting Over, and we do transitional housing and reentry work in Southern California, not Los Angeles, Southern California. And, we work in the intersections of criminal justice and housing, and we're just glad to be invited, and thank you.
Thank you all so much. I have a couple sort of questions that I've sort of pre-written for you all, but hope that sort of each answer will lead to some more organic discussion, and we can hopefully save maybe the last 10 or 15 minutes for any audience questions or reflections. So first, Andrea, can you tell the audience what sort of housing issues your clients at the Alameda County Public Defender's Office experienced, and how they're amplified by entanglement within the criminal legal system?
Sure. I'll start by just saying that I've been with the Public Defender's Office since 1994. So in the last 26 plus years, I've seen quite a bit, and I've certainly seen the changes and the increased volume of unhoused clients. We have clients who come to us who are unhoused, and we have clients who, because of the system involved, become unhoused. And in those populations, we see people from a myriad, obviously, of circumstances, people who are unhoused because they came out of juvenile delinquency or dependency systems and didn't transition well into an adult situation. We have people who come to us unhoused, quite a great number of them who have mental health issues, some who are not allowed by their family, friends to reside in their houses anymore because their experiences, their issues have just been too much for the family to care for, which have led them to be unhoused. We have people, obviously, who are unhoused, who have suffered from substance abuse issues. We also have people who come into the system not being unhoused, but because of the allegations of maybe violence in the home, orders that are made by the court will not allow them to return back to that home. So they then become unhoused due to those reasons. We have people who come into the system, remain in the system for years in jail or prison. And when they re-enter, they have some initial temporary housing, but not permanent housing. So we see those clients as well. We see clients who come in who to the system who are not yet convicted of crimes that would make them 290 registrants, sexual registrants, which then leads to them being unhoused or being ineligible to participate in some of the other housing programs. So those are some of the populations that we see for a myriad of reasons.
Yeah, that resonates with me because I was previously was a public defender in Contra Costa County, and many of my clients who were facing misdemeanors in Contra Costa County were unhoused. So some of the things, they'd be facing charges related to possession of a knife that they would use to open cans and other things for sustenance, or would be very known to law enforcement. So, were pretty much routinely harassed. And so it would sort of, every couple of months catch a new case. And one client in particular, which at least for me was one of the reasons I wanted to be able to do sort of systemic change work, was a client who had faced a charge related to criminal threats, and we won. Got the case dismissed before trial, but she had been on the Section 8 waiting list for 7 years, and even though we were successful in getting the case dismissed, she lost her spot, and for me that was, as a attorney and advocate, that was something that was sort of just kind of like took all the wind out of the sails at once, sort of being happy for her and her being happy that this threat that started off as a felony threat and then got put down to a misdemeanor, and then eventually got the case kicked all together. That innocence didn't stop her from losing her spot. So it's for me, it's like very, very resonant just in terms of the clients we would see, the issues that they would have, even getting to court, and how that would lead to further criminalization or bench warrants and all those sorts of things. So thank you for sharing, and hopefully we can get more into some of the policy solutions or some of the gaps that we're seeing as the conversation continues as well. Ken and Vonia, I'm hoping that you all, both as folks who've been impacted by the system itself, and as folks who are policy advocates who work on the reentry side, amongst other things, can tell a little bit about what sort of issues that you're seeing.
Vonia, you want to go first?
I can. Good to see you. And I think that's a question, and both of you, Brandon and Andrea, have both really hit upon a couple of really significant issues. I don't know if this is particular to Riverside County, but I see a lot of families, mothers in particular, who are faced with making a decision about whether to let their youth return home after a juvenile adjudication, which involved some type of detention. And so in our county, the district attorney picks up and files fraud charges against the parent for either not reporting or not reporting in a timely manner. And I am system impacted directly, grew up with homeless issues, incarceration, and going in and out of the system And then I went to law school in my second life. And so I hear about some of the cases, both through our transitional housing and the work that we do in partnership with our local ACLU chapter. So this particular woman came to me with the fraud charges. We beat her case and it was dismissed, but she lost her Section 8 housing. So she was displaced, as was her entire family. And the way the fair housing hearings are set up, you have a fair housing hearing that you can't defend yourself in while you have a pending criminal case. And that information isn't kept private at anyway. So it's a catch-22. So many women, once these charges are made, will take a plea deal, agree to pay money back that they don't have, and still lose their subsidized housing. That's one issue and one intersection that we see. And I guess the greatest issues we see are around convictions, evictions, and income qualification, which means if you're not making 3 times the rent, that you can't lease, or you have these gaps. And so working with the reentry population for the past decade, those are the most significant barriers. And it was a no deal at all for Section 8 housing and other housing subsidies, because the policies always excluded system impacted folks, directly impacted people. They would have a look back period, whether it's 3 years or 10 years, it's too long. And those are the issues that we see.
Thank you for that, Vonia, and thank you, Brandon and Andrea. I mean, I'm here in the Oakland Bay Area, so some of the things that we see in Oakland and Berkeley and San Francisco are a little bit different, but all the same, really, from what Vonia sees down there in Riverside. You know, one of the things that I'd like to speak to is the difficulty of making the transition from transitional housing to permanent housing for people who've been formerly incarcerated. So there is a stopgap measure for transitional housing that looks very much like the prison system. It's structured like the prison system in many cases, and it doesn't provide people a lot of dignity in being let free after a traumatic experience of incarceration. But probably even more difficult and heartbreaking for me as a directly impacted person is to watch people who are doing all of the things that they're supposed to do. They're getting off parole, they're going to work at transitional jobs 9 to 5 every day for 6 months to a year, and then be facing a situation where they don't have access to permanent housing. And so I have a lot of friends, a lot of women that I know that I've worked with that have been formerly incarcerated that find themselves actually having to do these co-living situations. And one example that I like to bring up is there's a house in East Oakland now where I know 10 formerly incarcerated men have pooled their money together to live in this 4-bedroom house. Now they've gotten out of transitional housing. They can't afford housing in Oakland or the Bay Area. And they've like pooled their money and they're like sharing bathrooms. And it reminds me very much of the prison system. And so, you know, this year we co-sponsored with Housing California and Corporation for Supportive Housing, AB 328, which was brought forth by Assemblymember Chu to reallocate dollars from closed prisons into the community to provide supportive housing and permanent housing models, along with workforce development components, you know, primarily to be led by people who are directly impacted, who understand holistically what needs to happen. I mean, you know, Vonia's Starting Over program does wonderful things for women down there. Part of the reason why they're able to do the wonderful things that they do is because she's directly impacted and has an insight that people like GEO and Health Right 360 and all of these other organizations that are running quasi prison systems don't have. And unfortunately, we got stalled in suspense this year, but we'll be continuing to work for the budget for next year to bring that bill to fruition, to reallocate those closed prison dollars, but really providing a bridge to permanent housing. And then the other piece that I would add to that is, what is the intersection between permanent housing and livable wage? Because another thing that happens in this quasi pay for play industry that's happened in reentry is that you have these transitional job services that are providing low wage, typically high labor jobs with not a lot of ability to reskill or upskill, and don't provide people the economic mobility or capability to thrive in a way where they can access affordable housing in places like San Francisco and the Bay Area, which is very expensive to live, in LA County, which is another place that's very expensive to live. And so we don't necessarily think that you can separate the two, housing and livable wage, access to livable wage, because we think those two things are codependent and have to be thought about as the whole for reentry. So I would just invite everybody to think about that also, the economic mobility piece and the access to livable wage piece that's missing from some of these conversations about long-term housing and permanent housing.
Yeah, and thank you both. I mean, sort of in between what both of you all sort of were speaking about, sort of, you know, it brought to mind that a colleague of mine, when I was at the East Bay Community Law Center and training Berkeley law students, I was able to, I wrote a law review article on sort of like ability to pay programs and defines a fee space. And a colleague of mine, Deborah Archer, who recently became the president of ACL, National ACLU, her and I were trading articles back and forth, and she had written a piece about all these sort of crime-free housing policies. And I know that, you know, the Atlantic and other folks did articles on those where it's, even if you sort of related to the story I was telling about my client and being on the Section 8 list, where you now have these cities all across California that have these sort of crime-free housing programs. So even if you can be evicted, even if you have not actually been charged, if somebody related to you has been arrested, you can be evicted. And that sort of like is at the forefront of any of the system involvement. Then you have the things that happen once you are actually entangled in the system. And then you have the things that Ken and Vonia were speaking about that happen when you are outside of the system now, doing all the things that you're supposed to be doing, but for a myriad of reasons and a myriad of gaps, like are finding it hard to be to navigate. And here at ACLU, you know, a lot of things that we are seeing and working on right now are things related to ordinances that sort of criminalize like everyday behaviors of unhoused folks. So during the pandemic, obviously influenced by the housing crunch, there has been a sort of proliferation of ordinances that ban RV parking, for example. And if you get more than 3 tickets in a 12-month span, you could be charged with a misdemeanor. In other places, if you it's a criminal act for you to store your personal belongings on a public street, right? And because we know that sort of disproportionately unhoused folks in California are Black, disproportionately systems involved, or formerly systems involved, right? Like this is another way in which things that should just be a ticket, right, end up being sort of further criminalization and beginning the entanglement with the criminal legal system all over again. And so some of those are some of the things that we're seeing, which aside from the fines and fees that people can't pay, come with other sort of consequences like having your vehicle towed or as I said, being charged with the misdemeanor, in some places a felony for things like, you know, having a dog in a place that has been slated to be a place where you cannot. So I thank you all for sort of sharing what you all seeing on the ground, and that kind of brings me to my next question, which is for anyone can feel free to jump in, which is how are your individual organizations working to change or impact some of these you've all spoken about? And Ken, I know you started talking about some of that with the introduction of the bill.
I'll jump in, Brandon. Oh,
okay. No, go ahead, Andrea.
Okay. I'm over here chomping at the bit, I think a little bit, because I'm thanking God that I have not ever seen anybody charged with a misdemeanor for the offenses that you described, Brandon. I don't know how I would still be in my skin to see somebody being charged with a misdemeanor for storing private belongings on a public street here in Oakland. So I just thankfully, I haven't yet seen that. However, I would say for our office, you know, I've been around long enough to know what to look for. And the one thing that we always have to do, and I train to do, is to listen to our clients. So even though our mantra is to represent those who are charged with criminal offenses, we understand that we need to listen to what it is that brought our clients to our attention for whatever reason. And that is not always glaring by the four corners of a police report. So we make sure that we're listening to their needs and try to address whatever collateral consequences might come about from any conviction that they might have while they're under our supervision. So we have a myriad of collaborative courts that are here that we can, direct people to, so that they can participate in and connect with services in the communities, something like drug courts, mentor diversion courts, mental health courts, so that we can connect them with services outside of our office. We also internally have social workers that work in our office, so that we are able to connect persons with those social workers even before we're finished resolving their cases, so that they can connect them whatever they need going forward. And we also have over the last, I think, 3 years, persons that we call partners for justice. So they work like social workers, but they are not social workers, but they do that type of work where they're able to connect our clients to resources. And then they are an amazing partnership with our attorneys who don't have the time, the ability, the resources to look for some of those things. So we partner internally in our office with those partners for justice and social workers, and connect people with them to help them then deal with barriers to being unhoused and whatever that they are needed is, and connect them with organizations that can help them with that.
Thank you.
I don't mind chiming in.
Conversation with folks, with some of the folks in your office working on some of those issues as it relates to towing and other things. Sorry, Ken.
No, go ahead. My apologies. I would just add for us. I mean, I think that there's a couple of different issues. There's supportive people who need supportive housing, and how, we need to develop more supportive housing models as a right for folks that aren't tied in necessarily to some type of clause or program or some other type of thing. I mean, that's something that should be happening. And then there's also this other idea of access and providing people access into affordable housing, permanent housing, livable wage that allows them to access those things, and economic mobility. And I think that there are some steep and wide gaps in between each of those things that I named, that we as advocates need to press harder on to build bridges for folks, to give people what they need and support the people in the ways that are necessary. We've really tried to focus, just as a reentry direct service provider, on really a holistic, full wraparound service model, where we're imagining men and women in California who are coming out of the prison system who need space to detox the prison experience, which is traumatic. I served 24 years in prison, almost 9 years in solitary confinement. It's a traumatic experience. And people need time to kind of unwind and unpeel the layers that have built up in prison culture in California. Prison culture in California is one of the most racist, toxic cultures in the country, based on race-based violence, et cetera, and so forth. And so these things build up over time, and people need space and time to be able to unwind a lot of that. And then also they need opportunity to be skilled up. The prison system does a terrible job at providing people skill sets necessary to compete. Most of the people that I know that come out of prison after a decade or so have never seen a smartphone. Don't know how to pay for a Subway sandwich using a digital and a piece of plastic. I mean, we come from neighborhoods where we work in the cash economy. At least when I was growing up, it was cash economy. Now we're in a digital economy. So we're not equipping people with the ability to survive in this digital economy, in this digital landscape that we're in. And we're relegating people to very low wage jobs that don't allow you to get an apartment. I know a lot of people right now that are working $17, $18 an hour jobs, and they can't afford a studio apartment in Oakland. Facts. I mean, they're telling me, Ken, I'm only bringing home $2,300 a month. To get a studio at 400 square feet is $2,000 a month, and they can't live. So we're trying to do our best to work with skill providers to give people the tools necessary to go out there and compete to get a job. I tell everybody, you deserve $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 a job just like anybody else. Andrea spoke earlier about collateral consequences. I don't think that people recognize that in California, there's over 40,000 different types of collateral consequences that attach to somebody who has a felony conviction. I mean, imagine if you had to wear 40,000 handcuffs. That's what it feels like when you navigate life, is you're still saddled with this notion of this civil death, and it makes it extremely difficult to access housing, for example, and jobs. So we definitely need to do a better job at that, and we're doing our best to do that with some of the programs that we've put together.
I just wanted to add that Starting Over didn't start this work with a lens on policy, a lens on any kind of systems work. Those things happened organically as a result of what we found with the folks that were coming into our housing program. And I think Andrea made a great point. We had to listen. We had to listen beyond the immediate need and find out. And what we discovered were these weren't behavioral issues that were driving most of the incarceration, that there were systemic issues that also needed to be addressed. And so organically and holistically, we started looking into housing, into employment, into family reunification, into participatory defense models based upon what folks' needs were. And we have started this work with a transitional living environments for people who were willing to stop using substances. And we had to change and add harm reduction houses because not everyone was ready to take that leap. And so it is a, do no harm and refund the community every way that we could think of. And so oftentimes these could be polarizing, especially in areas where we're operating at. But the truth is, most of the problems or what leads to recidivism more than anything else is through policy. We say you can't get housing assistance with the criminal background history. We say crime-free housing is good, but who is it good for? And how is it good to leave people on the streets versus bringing in adequate housing supply and making sure system impacted people have access to the housing solutions? And when we talk about economic mobility here, and we talk about how that looks here, it's something that we've had to put on the radar. So we have a program called Path to Staffing, Employment, and Entrepreneur Development, because not everyone is going to get a job. Many of the folks we work with have to create their own wealth, and many of them have skills that are transferable because they've spent their whole life in, as you called it, Ken, the cash economy. And so how do we lift up our community in a way that removes the stigma that they live with and carry, not just the collateral consequences, those are real, but there's also a stigma that makes more of us suffer in silence than should be. And opportunities are only becoming available because of the work you all are doing and people like you, the people that are listening. All the gains that we've had, for the last decade or so have been because people have pushed for it. And now perhaps some would say we might be at a tipping point, but whether we are or not, now is not the time to stop pushing. I read a letter today from the Secretary of HUD, and they're saying those CARES dollars need to be allocated to folks who are coming home without a look back period. And so they're hearing you. And we have to make sure they keep hearing us, I think, and we have to keep listening. So we don't have the answers. Yes, I'm system impacted. I come from a family of system impacted folks, generations of us, but I don't have the answers for re-entering today. The people in closest proximity to re-entering do, and that's who we have to listen to. That's who informs our work, and that's the practice and model that has helped us to help over 1,500 people reentry in Riverside County. We provide housing for men and women in Riverside County and Los Angeles County. We do most of our policy and advocacy work in Riverside County because it's thirsty. Riverside County is probably 40 years behind you all in the Bay Area and a good 15, 20 years behind LA County. So that gives you an idea of the conservative nature of our county and their desire to punish Black and brown bodies. So
Yeah.
we have to talk about race, Brandon.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to allude to in my previous comments, saying that we know that, you know, particularly in California, disproportionately, the unhoused population is disproportionately Black, right? And, you know, though it was a terrible sort of decision, or opinion out of LA recently, as it relates to unhoused folks on Skid Row, one of the more interesting things about that particular opinion was just the amount of time that was spent piecing together the decades of policy that has resulted in a disproportionate amount of unhoused folks being Black. And this is also happening at a time where now we have the reparations task force. And I've been in conversation with some organizations around framing around that, which is like, you can't really have that conversation again without centering both the sort of historic and current harms, right? Like you had last year, the bill to open up the franchise of being able to sit on juries. And I think the stats there was something like 33%. I think I'm under counting, but it was something like that. 33% of Black men in the state of California were barred from serving on juries as a result of a felony, right? And every little, well, not every little, but every sort of like franchise, whether it's voting, whether it's housing, right, is impacted by the criminal legal system. There was there's a piece I read yesterday that talked about pushing back against the narrative of the absence of Black fathers, right? We know that like Black fathers are actually more present for their children, but it's pushing back against this narrative. I think there was a piece in written by the Federalist or something that said, you know, something about like marriage, right? Trying to get at this idea that Black families are married less, and that's impacting parenting, which contributes to this narrative around Black fatherhood. But the pieces that countered that talked about, you know, you can't talk about parenthood, right? Even though we know that Black fathers are actually more present, without talking about how many Black fathers are the ones who are not present not by choice, but are not present because they are incarcerated, right? So like all of these different pieces, and that was I think this sort of like narrative piece is something that that we need to continue to work through. Is something we've been doing in the sort of fines and fees space, right? The way that courts are funded on the backs of Black and brown folks who are disproportionately impacted by the criminal legal system. And the last thing I would just say that I think is related to this narrative piece is even how we talk about criminalization or behaviors that are criminalized. So there was a sort of long thread on Twitter recently that talked about how we determine what things are and are not criminal. So the vast majority of things are not criminal, and they have to be pursued through civil means, right? So wage theft, right? Corporations make their whole living and sustainability by wage theft, right? Because you have to go through a whole process through the civil system to be able to do it. Now, if I take money from Ken can you know, report that to the police. But if there's wage theft that happens, you can't, right? So like even the way that we talk about this narrative around criminalization, I think is also sort of important. Ken, I thought I saw you with your momentarily there's like a blip with the hand, so I want to make sure that I got to you. But Vonia, what you said sort of got or gets at this this next question, and we sort of been thinking or talking through it a little bit, but just in case we've missed something here, any of you, what sort of gaps do you see in the current narrative frames around housing, around reentry, and what sort of policy gaps do you all see? And I know we've been getting at some of that, but just in case folks want to more fully flesh some of that out.
But if I could chime in on the policy piece, I think that, some of the work that us and Housing California and others have been involved with in reference to creating comprehensive policy that offers support framework. I mean, so many of the criminal justice organizations that we all know and love and who do great work are primarily focused on what happens on the front end, right? Changing laws, challenging excessive sentencing laws, et cetera. But in Sacramento, there's not a lot of conversation about the infrastructure needed to support decarceration. And what are the systems and mechanisms needed to buoy folks after they've spent decades in prison. And so, we really believe that policy, to Vonia's point earlier, is very important in this conversation. And it's just now where legislators are starting to listen to policy conversations around housing and workforce development models. There's no serious bucket of money outside of the BSCC, which has its own challenges for CBOs, in workforce or housing for justice involved people. And so we're really trying to change the narrative of that. I mean, Karen Bass has a great bill at the federal level that we modeled, the one-stop shop reentry bill that imagines having these housing programs and workforce programs run by directly impacted people who understand exactly what it is we need to transition and reintegrate back into the community in a safe way. But again, I would just add that we can't emphasize policy enough, and taking away resources from CDC's current $16 billion budget. And I always give pause after I say $16 billion because the prison population has decreased 25% in the last 5 years, but the budget's doubled. And I'm not sure that, Californians are watching, and most of those dollars are going to fatten the CCPOA and not going to help people transform. They're not going to housing programs. They're not going to infrastructure development, which is what's needed in California, because there's 38,000 people that get out of prison a year. And so the question is, are we just giving people $200 in gate money, which has been the same since 1973, and a bus ticket to LA County or the Bay Area or the IE or wherever? And then what is our expectations of what happens after that? Right. And so policy, I think, it really needs to undergird a lot of the conversations that we have and that we're having today.
And I would just add, in assistance of policy work, there has to be community engagement, civic engagement, to the point that they can hear you, or that the legislator understands that there are people behind me who want this to happen, and are willing to take time out of their lives to make sure it happens. So we use a model, we call it a hybrid. So we do policy work, and then we also do base building and organizing through our All of Us or None chapter that we have. And that's been effective for us in small wins. We've been able to move housing authority policy around the look back period. We were able to do some work around visitation. And then when all else fails, litigation is another option. And when it comes to crime-free housing, we've had some wins here. And really, I mean, we all deserve to live in crime-free housing. So it's not the definition that we're fighting against. It is the application and the translation. What do you think crime-free housing means? I don't think it means looking at my background. I think it should be looking at what I'm doing today. And that's the whole problem with it. And this is a law enforcement creature. This is something that they created to help make sure that system impacted people remain on the streets, so that they become simple fodder for a system that feeds off of them and spits them out. And so we see it over and over and over. And so our work is redefining what crime-free housing is. If you are saying you're developing crime-free housing, or you want crime-free housing, and we're relying on a system where we put people who have been convicted, or most often just pled guilty to a crime, then there's something wrong with that. It's it doesn't make sense. It's circular. So if we really want to reduce crime, we reduce the trauma of incarceration and we invest in alternatives to incarceration, and housing is one of those things. There's no way around it. Housing is an alternative to incarceration. We pay $81,000 a year to house someone in a state penitentiary, and we could pay $40,000 and house a whole damn family and feed them for $40,000 a year. So when I do the math, it doesn't measure up until I put into the equation our addiction to punishment and punitive measures for Black and brown and poor bodies in this country. And it's historic. I mean, you don't have to like it, but it is what it is.
Mm-hmm. And that, you know, what you both just said kind of, I think, to me, gets at both the narrative and the sort of policy piece. So the narrative aspect is that housing is a benefit, right? That can or should be taken away, right? Because of something. Where if we were thinking that everybody's deserving of clean, safe housing, then that wouldn't be the case. It wouldn't be the case that my client who actually beat her case lost her place on Section 8, because those two things don't have anything to do with each other. But we've created a narrative that like certain people are deserving of that and other people aren't, such that just merely being charged or arrested means that you're not deserving, right? And so I think that's kind of like the narrative piece. And then on policy piece, ACLU and other folks, because we're seeing so much of this proliferation of these ordinances I mentioned earlier in conversation with Housing California and others have started to think about what a legislative push for housing as a protected, or housing status as a protected category as a bill with that might look like, how that might stop or prevent some of the ordinances that we are seeing, might open up various advocacy opportunities as well. So that's something that we are starting to think about as a potential bill to introduce next year. So Tori, who I see is moderating the chat, has been involved in those conversations with Housing California. We're starting to sort of like build out a coalition around those things as well. Andrea, I know you've been chomping at the bit earlier, so I want to make sure that there's some space for you to hop in here as well.
I'm just excited about the conversation and just wanted to add to it. You know, over the years, we've seen so many different things. And what's most exciting right now is just what Vonia pointed out, is the community engagement. Having system involved persons, people from the community involved, and making policy that makes sense is what we need. We've had policies, bureaucracies, procedures for years, but they just never make sense. Right, and people were able to hide behind those policies and procedures and say why they could not house persons that needed to be housed, as opposed to using policies and procedures that made sense so that we can house those who need to be housed. And so it makes sense to have persons who have been through, have persons who are listening, have persons who are on the grounds, being the front runners and making laws and policies that make sense. When I ran juvenile back in 2010 from 2010 through 2016, we had a great push to reduce the amount of children, not just in juvenile hall, but reduce the amount of children that we were removing from the homes. We were spending thousands of dollars per youth to send them to out-of-state placements for 8 months, for 12 months, for 16 months. And then they were being returned back to the community that they said was inept to get them prepared in the first place, without changing anything in that community. All you have to do is take those dollars that you were using to send that child out of state, to invest it in that house and in that community so that they have what they needed. Because what you found is that they would go away, they would be in some luxurious place for a while, they would do great, and then they would come back home and they're still left. They return back to the trauma that you never did anything about while they were gone. And so how do they survive in that? So I'm glad to see, like, over the years, now we've seen the great reduction of children being removed from their homes, and we're removing probations are now getting with taking those dollars and investing in the homes to keep those children in the home, keep those monies in the communities that we're serving. Also, just I want to keep in mind one thing that was always very, very dear to my heart is keeping children who sexually exploited children who didn't have safe places to go. They simply just did not. And so they were on the streets, or they were from pillow to post. And we started a girls' court here in Alameda County to really deal with those particular youth. And that program started because we were listening to the girls. We were listening to them. And it wasn't about charging them. They never should have been in the criminal justice system. I mean, how could you consent to something that you're underage to be able to consent to? That's ridiculous. But over time, social services began to play a bigger role with them. But we started programs to find housing, and not temporary housing, because they need permanent housing. We all need to live. You know, it's ridiculous to me that in the middle of a pandemic, we would have people who would come back in custody time after time after time. And time after time, I would argue to get them out of custody, and the DAs would object because they said, well, they're still going in 7-Eleven and still in the hot dog. Really? Well, they're still hungry just like you and I are. They still need to eat. They still need to be housed permanently. And finding somebody a fix for 20 days or 30 days is not the answer. It's not the answer. And it's quite offensive that somebody would think that by finding somebody a location for 20 and 30 days is sufficient, because it wouldn't be sufficient for them. So I just wanted to add that I think it's super important that the community stays involved, and that we listen to those who have been system involved as well.
And just from a fiscal perspective, you know, you think about, you know, I used to have clients who, you know, getting banished from Safeway or whatever, and just from a economic perspective, the amount of time and resources to call the police, have a police response, take the person to jail, have them be arraigned, represented by a public defender or another attorney, prosecuted by the DA, just the amount of time and monetary resources that are utilized for that, for someone who stole because they're hungry, just doesn't make any economic sense, you know.
That's right. I had a lady yesterday who was in custody on a warrant from 2016 for stealing some meat. So she spent 4 days in custody from a 2016 case during the time in the middle of a pandemic where the emergency bail schedule says that should be 1 cent. So how many people who had the ability, the decision-making ability to not charge that case, to not arrest her, on a warrant, to cite her out, all passed on those decisions and thought it would be better for her to appear in front of a judge, for me to then argue with a DA to get that person out of custody and dismissed.
That's ridiculous. Go ahead, Ken.
No, I was just I wanted to add and build a little bit on what has been said, just in reference to those obstacles, again, that are faced by formerly incarcerated people. I mean, we actually have one of our leadership team who got out of prison after serving a life sentence, had a job day one, livable wage job, and got off parole. And because of he went to 12 different apartment buildings to try to get his own apartment. He was denied by every single one of them. It started with the felony conviction. If it wasn't the felony conviction, you have no rental history, you have no credit, this and that. And this is a guy that had a job the first day he walked out of prison and was doing all the right things and has continued to do all the right things. Finally, our organization just went ahead and signed for him to get housing. But the question is, if you have people who are doing all the right things, and even if they're not, don't have access to put a roof over their head, I'm not for sure as a community, as a society, as Californians, what we are expecting the alternative to be. People complain about, you know, the unhoused, people complain about, you know, crime, people complain about all these different things. But when you're pushing people to the margins and to the corners, again, the question is, I don't know what it is that we expect the alternative is to be if we're not providing access. So it's important for us to continue, to Vonia's point, to not only community organize, but to bang on the legislators' doors regularly and often and loudly, to open up those doors of access and pathways for people to not only have permanent housing, short-term housing, permanent housing, but also, again, access to economic mobility and some type of livable wage employment in places that are unaffordable.
Yeah,
Brandon, can I talk about the mental health piece?
Oh, sure, definitely.
Because that is huge right now. And we're getting so many people, so many more people in custody who have mental health issues and that simply are not being addressed. And this pandemic did not help that situation. They're coming back, they're not having access to care, they're getting released, they're unhoused. Usually they're getting released with a stay away from the most familiar place they know. So they go back. It could be a parent's home that they're not supposed to be at because the mother just can no longer care for them. And because of their mental health issues, it may have escalated to something violent. So they have to stay away. But it's their safety net. It's what they know. They go back to the home. They haven't said anything, but then they're rearrested and then they're out and then they're rearrested. And they're not enough to be conserved because we can't get them conserved yet. So they're not in that system. They shouldn't be in the criminal system. They're not being provided help and they're on the street. Where are they supposed to go? And we're seeing them come back into custody time and time and time again. And even with those who are being declared unable to stand for trial, the services, they're staying in custody for months at a time trying to get services. The access is ridiculous now. So when we talk about how do we house that particular population, where do they fit in the policies and the system? That's a gap that I don't think of a population that we're not reaching and not reaching as quickly enough because they don't have the mechanisms that when they get out of custody to go someplace, go where? When they get out, what is happening on day one? They don't have the ability to go to most jobs. They don't have jobs. Some of them can't even get to SSI. We actually had somebody who has a stay away from Social Security building. That makes sense. We have somebody who showed up at a hospital, had a mental health issue, but didn't have an appointment. So they were told to leave. And when they got into it with the security guard, they were arrested. I mean, where are they supposed to go? The people who have mental health issues. That's a huge population that I think we need to address and address very quickly. Some of them, a lot of them are 290 registrants because they have indecent exposure priors, right? They have misdemeanor indecent exposure priors because they were unhoused at the time that they exposed themselves. Somebody saw it, somebody made a decision to arrest them. Now they have to register. If you have to register, that reduces the amounts of available housing for you, which means that you're on the street and you're probably not registering every month because if you're unhoused, you have to register every single month. And then here in Oakland, you have to get an appointment to be able to register. How exactly does a person with mental health issues, this person who is unhoused, without transportation, without financial means, be able to do all of that?
Yeah, that resonates with me because when I was in Contra Costa County, I had a client who I think she had 5 or 6 open cases, and one came from her getting out and breaking the window of a police car right outside of the jail to be to go back because she had nowhere to go. It's just it's just kind of like a heartbreaking thing. So I appreciate you raising it because it's certainly a population of folks that are not being met where they are with things that are helpful for them. And that kind of dovetails into this next question that I had, which is, if you could change one law or enact one policy tomorrow, what would it be?
For me, it would be housing as a right for everybody in California. It's a kind of a macro, but definitely specifically for justice involved people, especially coming out of incarceration. There's tens of thousands of people that come out of incarceration, another tens of thousands of people that don't have access to short and long-term housing. Short-term, yes, long-term, no. And so providing that housing as a right for people and the unhoused, to me, would be a big policy win if we could get it.
I think the one I just touched on is the 290 registrant that prevents people from being unhoused and even being allowed to be in shelters, specifically for misdemeanor offenses that have not aged out or timed out.
And you all took mine. So that's what I was thinking too, like housing for all. I don't think there's any empirical data that says that it's riskier to rent or lease property to someone who has a criminal conviction history. I don't think it's any more riskier. And I have not seen any data that says it is. So why are we doing this? We're always either screening something in or out. And I think the policy we just need to have housing for all policies and not screen out based on criminal conviction histories or gaps in rentals and all that other. Those are just barriers to make sure that there's somebody we can step on. And we don't have to step on people. We don't have to other people. So thank you. Great question.
I think for me, it'd be removing the authority to charge. It basically decriminalizing all sort of traffic or municipal related instances, so that you can't be impossible to get a parking ticket for parking your RV and it resulting in a misdemeanor because that's just a ridiculous outcome for parking a vehicle or for loitering or throwing trash or whatever. Like those are policies enacted specifically to harm and criminalize unhoused folks. So I think removing that authority would be something that I would do if I had a magic wand, I suppose. And then the final question I had, and then we can see if maybe we can answer some of these answers in Q&A, and if there are some others as well, is what advice do you have for advocates who work mostly in the housing space about ways they can connect to more work at the intersections of criminal justice and housing justice?
My initial response is going to be work more with community-based organizations. And we need to put down these silos or break down these siloed walls of organizational focus and industry focus specifically. So sometimes when you get into spaces, housing people would just want to push housing, and they have a vested interest in housing, and then they don't necessarily have a vested interest in workforce or criminal justice or other things. And I think that finding ways to break down those barriers and collaborate will take us all farther in our respective industries. And that goes across to the CJ organizations specifically, and, workforce organizations, et cetera. If finding ways to work together to find holistic solutions is the answer, because silos have a tremendous amount of challenges, and they actually impede progress when we work in silos.
And I agree. I think what we have done in even public defense work is understand and recognize exactly what Ken says, is that we can't work in silos, we need others. And which is why we have a public defender's office that houses social workers and houses Partners for Justice and houses immigration attorneys, because a whole clean slate team of attorneys, because we understand that we need to deal with all of the issues that come before our clients. Obviously, first and foremost is the criminal defense piece. However, we care about those persons in which we are representing, and we need to reach out to others to be able to help connect them to whatever resources they need to be able to thrive in life.
Vonia.
So I think that's important too. I think community-based organizations are a step, but not everyone is organized or part of an organization. So I think getting down to the base building, it still comes back to engaging folks who might not currently be engaged and getting them connected to this work, or understanding what their voice means and how it's centered in the work, I think is really helpful. So I would agree with Andrea and Ken on what to do, and I would say take it down to the one-on-one. I volunteered with the Public Defender's Office, and the one thing about public defenders is they have one-on-one interactions every day with the folks that we're trying to reach. And in our particular county, I don't know about other counties, our public defender is very, very under-resourced in terms of their capacity. And in terms of, if you look at what the district attorney gets versus what the public defender, it's not, our public defender doesn't even get 30% of what the district attorney gets. And they take care of 85% of the cases. So it's difficult, but they're in a great strategic place to reach the people that we want. So I think partnerships between community-based organizations and public defenders' offices creates an opportunity for CBOs like ours to be force multipliers for the public defender. And so how do we create the trust and build those kinds of relationships is currently what we're undertaking in our county, because I think it's critical. I just got a whole new appreciation for public defenders when I finally got my moral character determination done and was able to practice, when I went in there and saw the public in a whole different way. So, but I think there's a huge potential for leveraging those partnerships and relationships.
Yeah, I think some of that has changed since I left. I mean, one of my feeling as a misdemeanor public defender was just like, obviously the important focus on representing the criminal case, but that it was disconnected from these other things that I was seeing, and I've been glad that my former position at the East Bay Community Law Center was able to create partnerships and work with Allegheny County Public Defender's Office. My friend Sadie does the clean slate stuff there. We had a clean slate clinic at East Bay Community Law Center. We worked with Ken and other folks in coalitions that we built. Eventually got Contra Costa County and other public defenders offices to be part of the coalition around fines and fees. Wrote an amicus for CARES Act funds for incarcerated folks with one of the public defenders offices. And so there seems to be like an evolution that is happening. San Francisco has my friend there, former student of mine, is director of policy at the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. And so there's been sort of, I think, a shift. I mean, obviously it's hard. I think I had 130 cases as a misdemeanor public defender in court every day. And so it's hard to carve out time, but I think the conversation is sort of shifting. Obviously, Brendan is very active on social media and in a lot of different places, bringing that perspective to the policy discussions. And so I think we need more of that as well. And I think to Ken's point about silos, because people don't experience life in these sort of like fragmented things. They experience life all at one time. And so our policy discussions and our coalitions have to be just as holistic as the experience of the people who are experiencing the harm. And so I think that's how I try to approach my work. And I hope that as part of this conversation, some of the folks who are watching this, who just engaged in housing, will sort of begin to outreach to other people, and we can continue to sort of build this movement. I saw a couple questions in the chat. We might not be able to get to all of them, but I see one specifically for you, Andrea, about the implementation of the Fair Chance Ordinance, and whether or not there's any stats to show a decrease in unhoused individuals with prior system involvement. I'm not sure if you know the answer to that, but that was directed at you.
I do not know the specific answer, and I don't know the answer. I could say that I don't know the statistics. I'm happy to do the research and respond to that person through you, Brendan, but I don't know the specific answer to that question on the statistics.
Yeah, I was trying to think if my short time in the city of Oakland, whether or not the Department of Race and Equity knows that answer. I'm not certain that it existed in the Oakland Indicators report. I mean, there's a lot of data in that report as it relates to systems involved folks, rental burdens, et cetera, but I'm not sure if they have that specific answer as well, but it's an excellent question. If they don't have that data, they should certainly be getting it.
Well, I would add too on that, Brandon, if I could just chime in there, that that ordinance passed right at the cusp of the pandemic, right? And during the last year, it's not a year old, so it would be very hard to track that, especially during the pandemic and some of the rental stuff that's gone on. But I imagine that probably next year or the year after would be a better indicator to be able to gather statistics once things come back a little bit more to normal, because it's so new.
That's helpful and makes sense to me as well. And I see this question. My sense is that this answer is that there are multiple movements, but I see this question that says, is there any legal movement to prevent people from losing their housing assistance, seeing as some people may have families who are single, the losses creating homelessness and possible recidivism? I feel like in a variety of ways, we all kind of like touched on different aspects of that. I off the top of my head don't know if there's like a specific legal movement, but I do know that folks are sort of continuing to try to challenge the narratives behind that and some of the policies that that bring that forward. And as I mentioned, we in conjunction with Housing California and others are thinking about a bill that would make housing status a protected category that I think would have some impact on that. So there are folks talking about it in a lot of different places. I'm not sure if other folks want to chime in as well. And I see. Okay, I see Vonia responding to one of the questions in chat. I mean, the importance of closing for-profit prisons. I mean, I think my answer, and this might be the last question that we get to. I just think for all the reasons that Ken and others said, my perspective is not just limited to for-profit prisons, but is broadly encompassing of the entire criminal legal system. You know, Vonia says that the prosecutor's office is much more well-funded as a manifestation of being part of law enforcement, for example, is an example of sort of like how we parse out who is entitled to what funding. So I think it's part of this broad sort of decarceration, broad sort of defund or reallocation of resources that we need to think broadly about the bloat in the criminal legal system and how we direct those monies to resources for services and other aspects that actually will allow people to thrive. I see your hand, King. Was that you?
Yeah, I wanted to add something to that. Just, you know, the person asked about private prisons. And, you know, there's been a lot of conversation about that. And obviously, most of us know about that. I would really provide an invitation to redirect that same mindset to the reentry space and talk about people that are in the reentry space, right? Which is about healing and pathways and housing and the opportunity to recover after a very traumatic experience. That's not the place for-profit. And when we start getting into the for-profit, where we're looking at placement fees and we're looking at basically group people together like they're at the bottom of a slave ship, like that's the time that we need to separate it and think about doing something a different way. So I would encourage us to start thinking about ways we can get the pay for play out of the reentry space, and how do we reallocate those dollars to community-based organizations that are actually on the ground, in the hood, providing the services, lifting people up and supporting people, rather than saying, how can I maximize a dollar? And it's not human-centered. Transformation, and this goes for us as directly impacted people, but it also goes for the community and why they need to pay attention. Transformation is not something that you can scale. It's not something that should be a pay for play. Like, this is a serious business. There's public safety implications. There's quality of life implications. There's a whole lot of implications that ripple out from us turning a blind eye to what's happening in these spaces when we allow these predators to come in, these people who want to charge $15 for a 5-minute phone call, and these people that want to put 25 people in a small space to try to maximize a dollar. We really need to pay attention to that and work harder together as a community to disrupt that methodology and that model.
Well said. I think a good place to end. I saw you about to chime in, Vonia. I think we're at time. I just want to thank you all again for being willing to give your time and expertise and perspectives in this conversation. It was powerful for me, and hope it was for others as well. And I hope it'll generate further discussions outside of this panel.
Yes, thank you to all of our speakers for just sharing your wisdom and having this incredible conversation. And we hope that continues on. Just some housekeeping things next to close us out. Make sure to visit the virtual exhibit hall, which is still going, for a chance to win some prizes. And you can also take a calming, mindful break by joining meditation and movement with Jess Napier. And then we look forward to seeing everyone at 2:45 for more music by hip hop artists and community leader Clean, before our closing keynote and kitchen table talk with guaranteed income pioneer Michael Tubbs, in conversation with Chris Haney, the executive director of California Budget and Policy Center. So thank you again all for an incredible conversation, and we look forward to seeing everyone else later on in the conference.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.